Good morning. My name is Andrea Jenkins. I am the Vice President of the City Council and Chair of its Committee of the Whole, and I am going to call to order this special meeting of the committee for Monday, November 26, 2018. With me at the dais today are Council members Gordon, Palmisano, Johnson, Goodman, Ellison, Schrader, Council President Bender, Councilmember Cunningham, Fletcher, yes, Reich, Cano, and let the record reflect that we do have a quorum. So, colleagues, we only have one single item on today's agenda, and that is the draft 2040 comprehensive plan. Today is the first of two markup sessions that are planned to allow council members to consider any amendments to that draft plan. It is our hope that we are able to bring forward and dispose of all major proposals to amend the plan today and to use the second markup session to review and finalize the entire document prior to the formal consideration of the entire plan by the full City Council at its regular meeting on Friday, December 7th. So before we begin, I would like to take the opportunity to review the timeline that has been an important part of this work. It stretches back to the prior council term in 2014 when the Metropolitan Council began its work to identify long-range trends and its plans for addressing some of those issues. The Met Council provided a policy-level guidance for local jurisdictions in its Thrive MSP 2040 plan, which was done in 2014. The City of Minneapolis, as with other metro area jurisdictions, was involved in those early plans, which helped to shape the creation of the city's draft comprehensive plan. That work has been ongoing since that time, tracking almost 4 years that have shaped this draft long-range plan for the future of Minneapolis. In 2016, the Council adopted a resolution that formally directed our long-range planning team in CPED to bring forward a comprehensive plan for the City of Minneapolis that was in alignment with the Met Council's policy guidance and which satisfied the requirements of the Metropolitan Land Planning Act. Our long-range planning team had been involved in every aspect of that work, and that has included multiple public engagement efforts to inform the community about this work and to provide opportunities for participation in the development of every aspect of that plan. Before we get started with our review, I want to invite our long-range planning director, Heather Worthington, to provide us with a current status of the draft plan and to summarize for us the highlights of the actions that have been taken to date in the creation of the draft comprehensive plan. Ms. Worthington.
Good morning, Council Vice President and Council members. I'd like to introduce the 2040 Comprehensive Plan draft that is before you this morning. It is the result of almost 2 years of community engagement, over 200 public meetings, over 18,000 comments received on the initial draft, which was released in March of this year, and additional comments received through the clerk's office for the draft that was released as a final draft in September. We made numerous revisions to the document. You have before you this morning a number of revisions that are part of the process of the markup of the comprehensive plan. There was a Planning Commission public hearing on October 29th, and you held a public hearing on November 14th. Both meetings were well attended, and we stand ready to answer any questions you have this morning. In front of you, you have a series of text amendments and then a series of map amendments. And in the audience is our planning manager, Paul Mogish, and our project leader, Joe Bernard. And so we all stand ready to assist this morning, and please let us know what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Worthington. And so now I will summarize the process we'll be following today in processing amendments. Again, it is our hope to bring forward all substantive amendments today so that we can ensure the draft plan is updated prior to the next markup session. That will allow all policymakers and the public to review the current status of the plan prior to final action. So again, as I've already stated, today is the first markup session. When we've completed our work today, the draft plan will be updated to incorporate all amendments we approve and will be forwarded to the regular committee of the whole meeting on Wednesday, December 5th for a second review and potential markup to put the draft plan in final form. Once we have the draft in final form, it will be forwarded to the full council for final action at its regular meeting on Friday, December 7th. So to help us organize amendments, staff has organized those proposals in alignment with the 14 goals in the draft comprehensive plan. A packet for each of the 14 goals that includes all anticipated amendments have been prepared by staff. And we will consider each packet of amendments separately. The entire packet will be introduced, and individual amendments that may require further discussion or modification can be pulled and acted on individually. We will transact all other amendments that do not require separate consideration as a group under a single vote, similar to how we handle consent items at the committee level. So, first, we need to consider the recommended amendments that have been forwarded to us by the Planning Commission. As you know, the Planning Commission did adopt several recommended amendments at its agenda on October 29th, following its public hearing. And those amendments are recommendations to this body. So we need to decide how to handle those recommendations, and we have three options. First, we need to decide which recommendations will not be considered by the council and will therefore need to be deleted from the agenda. Second, we need to decide which recommendations will be incorporated by the council as formal amendments in the draft comprehensive plan as they were submitted to us by the Planning Commission. Third, we need to decide which recommendations may be incorporated in the plan, but which still require further modifications by the council before being adopted as formal amendments to the comprehensive plan. And so staff has organized the Planning Commission's recommendations into three packets that align with the actions that I have just outlined. And I believe that the clerks have already distributed those packets. And I just want to reiterate that we will be using speaker management today, and Kelly will be helping us to manage the queues, so please be sure to sign in to speaker management if you haven't already done so. And the first packet includes those recommendations from the Planning Commission that are not going to be considered, which have not been identified by council members to be incorporated as formal amendments to the comprehensive plan. Those items will be deleted from the agenda. And I will give you, the council members, a moment to review those items on the first Planning Commission packet, which the clerks have distributed at the dais.
Madam Vice President?
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Just to clarify then, the packet that is in front, because there are several, the packet before the council right now should be labeled CPC number 1. CPC number 1 includes recommended amendments that were forwarded to us by the Planning Commission, which have not been identified by any single council member to carry forward. So the proposal is to eliminate, delete from the agenda, and not take further in this process all of those recommendations listed in the packet labeled CPC number 1.
Thank you. And I will move this packet forward to begin discussion. And do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. And the discussion, we will begin with Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question. So if I'm looking, for example, at amendment number 2, which I have a very keen interest in, is it just that the general language and what's stricken out and what's underlined is all going to be eliminated in this proposal? So all of these things that are on here are being eliminated, or what's being eliminated is what's struck out and what's being added is what's underlined? I don't understand how to read this.
Councilmember Goodman, I believe the entire packet is being slated for deletion, but I am going to ask the clerk to help clarify.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Mogush at the podium is able to answer these questions.
Vice President Jenkins, Councilmember Goodman, in packet number 1, what you're looking at are amendments that were forwarded to the council, recommended to the council by the Planning Commission. So if you vote in the affirmative on an item in this packet, you are voting to not accept that recommendation from the Planning Commission.
At all, and I shouldn't pay any attention to what has been struck out and what is underlined.
It would revert to the text as staff proposed to the Planning Commission originally.
Which is shown here as,
Thank you.
which way? The original language is what's been struck out or lined through?
Vice President Jenkins, Councilmember Goodman, that's correct.
Okay, so just my example would be on items 1 and 2, I have really strong concerns about allowing housing and production and processing areas. For me, to be fair, it's about the future allowance of cannabis production in the city of Minneapolis. And what I've learned from other communities is that you have to have that zone somewhere, and that the most logical zoning is where there's production and processing. And if we allow housing in areas of production and processing, we're going to lose opportunities to have a truly equitable potential cannabis system. Because if we don't have places in the city, we're going to have places in the exurbs, and I think we really need to leave places for that. That's my motivating factor, and I like the language as proposed by Council Members Reich and Palmisano that strictly prohibits residential in production and processing areas.
Okay, next we have Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a comment on a few of the items. First, items 7 and 9 are the 2 that I've authored. I just wanted to briefly explain that these are 2 policies that the Planning Commission added, which are described in more general terms in other parts of the Minneapolis 2040 plan. For item number 7, I've proposed to strike this language that is about the physical context of buildings and how they how new buildings respond. And I just there is more general language in goal 5 action step F, but this language really doesn't work for many parts of the city that have a variety of development patterns, or parts of the city that are transitioning from one use to another, such as industrial to residential. So I've moved to strike this and to rely on the more general language that's found in Goal 5, Action Step F. And for the second one, similarly, this is about protecting solar air rights, and there is a more general statement in Goal 69, Action Step G, that talks about encouraging solar-friendly design and provisions that protect solar access. And I think through ordinance, any council member could take this a step farther and write more specific regulations, but that this amendment that the Planning Commission brought is very detailed and includes language that isn't legally defined, so that would really be best served through an ordinance. And then I'll just briefly comment on the industrial land. I think the intention from the Planning Commission was to look at parts of the city that are zoned for production and processing, but that have high development potential in terms of their built form. But that said, I do still support the amendments that Councilmembers Reich and Palmisano brought. I think we are down to a very small part of our land area that is now available for production and processing, and we need to be very careful about encroaching on that. So this doesn't mean that we couldn't revisit this in the future, but for now I think I'm more comfortable taking the approach of preservation.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I just noticed that there's two of these items, 11 and 13, that have my name listed as somebody proposing them from removal. Number 11 actually has to do with policy 75, and later there'll be an amendment where I just added language to this Rockwell. So it will hopefully, I'm assuming that amendment gets approved, that language will still be in the plan. So it's a little bit confusing that it's removed here. Also, in terms of the Kronzer Amendment 13, it really, I was trying to add another action step to Policy 94 and wasn't necessarily advocating the removal of any of the other action steps. I'm reading this as a staff recommendation, I guess, that if we were to approve an amendment I'll be making coming later having to do with historic view sheds, it might be redundant to have this section, but I'm actually fine with not removing this. And so maybe there's other amendments having to do with this one too, so I'm a little bit concerned about removing it and not knowing exactly what's going to be approved later. If that makes any sense?
The chair recognizes Councilmember Goodman.
Councilmember Gordon, I have an entire new policy that takes all of the language referring to shoreland overlay views, historic structures that's being introduced in the master amendment, which would address these issues. So basically staff was good enough to look through the entire plan and to take all of the things that had to do both with historic context, historic view sheds, and environmental protections and put them into a new policy called Preserving and Enhancing Public Lakes and Waterways, ensuring ongoing preservation and improvement of the natural and built environment near city lakes and waterways. That's coming later also. So it's its own thing now. I just want to make sure you're aware of that. So I don't mind this being eliminated because between what you're doing on view sheds and what I'm doing on the shoreline, those would be addressed through a new policy.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think that what I'm concerned about and that everybody probably maybe has followed a little of this with some of the historic landmarks in the city that aren't near water. So I'll keep that in mind, and I guess I'll watch carefully. I'm not necessarily going to move the Kronzer amendment right now, but we'll see where it lands later.
Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I appreciate the commentary. Specific uses in mind that require production. I appreciate hearing that even future industries that are not currently active in our community would be accommodated, but even current ones would not be accommodated if we did not have this land use. And many of these things we celebrate: cultural corridors, arts districts, brewing areas. These are the things that really make a lot of vibrancy, and they absolutely require an industrial, or as we're calling it now, production area. And I think the jobs component, was very well made from staff, not only in terms of the use and the economic development, but there's a sociological factor to this. When they analyzed who gets paid in these places, people of color get paid and paid well, extremely well, statistically significantly well. And that's something that we can't ignore as well, given our overarching goals around equity. That's where the rubber hits the road in terms of economic empowerment. And if you don't have proximity to opportunity, in many cases you don't have opportunity. So I appreciate the colleagues' support on this.
Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say that, this under number 1, I appreciate Councilmember Reich and Palmisano bringing forward the language flexibility around generally versus strictly. I do have problems with prohibited. I think that's pretty heavy-handed for a future that we don't quite know what it's going to look like, or what kind of technology is going to be available, or what kind of projects, creative projects could come together. So I'm feeling uncomfortable with the word prohibited in that item number 1, and I just wondered if either staff or some other folks could contextualize the heavy-handed nature of that language, just because typically I've noticed that we do tend to have ways to build more flexible language in some of the policy that we're promoting to really help respond to a variety of different scenarios that we might not be quite ready to decide on specifically at this moment. And so is there a future where you could have an amazing production and processing area coupled with some type of creative housing component? I believe so. I think the word prohibited might cause some problems in the future interpretation of those policies and decisions. So I'm just curious about why, prohibited was, I guess, favored over something that's a little bit more flexible, like discouraged or, dependent on other issues, where I do see some of that language is built into some of these other amendments, kind of down lower on the page.
Mr. Mogulus, would you like to address that question?
Vice President Jenkins, Councilmember Kano, I'd be happy to address that. First, the use of the word prohibited, Councilmember, it's a term that is very specific to zoning language. Now, of course, we are not at the point of zoning yet, so we do all need to be cognizant of the fact that this comprehensive plan lays out a framework and policies for setting us up as a city to then implement it through regulation in the zoning code. I will say that that staff's intent here was to use that word to be extremely clear that if this policy is adopted by the council in the comprehensive plan, that proposals for housing would not be considered in production areas. Now, I want to couple that, though, with an acknowledgement that on the future land use map in this draft plan, there are 2 different land use categories that deal with production and processing. The subject of this text that we're talking about here is the production and processing category. It's that small subset of the city that Councilmember Reich was speaking about just a moment ago, where the intent is to make sure we are protecting those areas for future employment uses. There's a second category in the draft future land use map called production mixed use that is very much in line, Councilmember Kano, with what you just described about allowing the kind of a mix of creative uses, creative production uses, and housing in some cases in those areas. So there is flexibility in those production mixed use areas as shown in the draft future land use map.
Thank you, Mr. Mogulus. Councilmember Kano? Thank you. You done? All right. So the motion is to delete from the agenda the recommended items from the Planning Commission. It has been properly seconded. Is there any more discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and those matters have been deleted from the agenda. Next, I will move to approve all recommendations submitted by the Planning Commission that were not identified by council members to be set aside for further modification prior to formal action. So the next packet that includes those recommendations from the Planning Commission, which the council will be accepting and incorporating as amendments to the comprehensive plan as they were submitted to us without further modification. And I believe that would be CPC amendments packet number 2. And since I'll give folks a little bit of chance to look that packet over. So, sorry, again, the motion is to adopt all the recommended amendments in this second packet that includes all recommendations from the Planning Commission which were not previously identified by any council member for further modification, and which we will be accepting and incorporating as formal amendments to the draft comprehensive plan. Is there any discussion on that motion? And I see, well, first, can I get a second? Thank you. So that motion has been seconded, and our first speaker is Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to pull item number 29. It's related to lighting at nighttime. It's well-intentioned, but I would say that the way that this language is written flies in the face of a lot of the best practices that are emerging around dark sky friendly ordinances. And that is something that's supported elsewhere in the comp plan, that we develop such an ordinance. And so I think there's a way to better achieve the balance of what the intent of the author is with the latest best practices. So I'd like to pull that item.
Thank you. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to speak generally in support of the amendments that the Planning Commission passed, which I think really fall into three major categories. The first is strengthening our city's commitment to fighting climate change. And I was really struck during the public hearing how many people spoke very passionately about the issue of climate change, particularly those who are younger than I am. Almost every single person in that age range sort of really begged us to do more aggressively to fight climate change. And many of these amendments do strengthen that commitment from our city to look at building standards that and transportation investments that are intended to reduce our carbon footprint. The second set of amendments, I think, are really focused on improving the design of buildings and the way that new development can contribute to the to our communities and to our neighborhoods, focused on design of buildings, on preservation of trees, and these are the details that you see when you serve on the Planning Commission, as I did, when you have so many buildings coming through for approval. So I really think that the detail that the Planning Commission took in some of these specific amendments related to design are important. And then the third is things that are focused on making sure that our infrastructure is ready to support new development. If we are going to focus new development almost entirely near transit, as we have been doing for the past decade, we really need to make sure that our transit and transportation systems are set up to provide transportation options for people. So I appreciate the ways that the Planning Commission has offered amendments that focus infrastructure investments in those parts of the city that are growing.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did want to call special attention and ask for clarification on amendment number 10 from Commissioner Rockwell from staff. The amendment text says prohibit driveways for new small-scale residential buildings on blocks that have alley access. That is similar to an amendment that staff helped to draw up for me, which was to require alley access for all 3+ unit residential buildings. So my intent with this, that perhaps is satisfied by Commissioner Rockwell, is when we have things on corridors, future transit corridors, we don't want there to be a backup and requirement and for people to need to ingress or egress from a multifamily structure onto a future transit corridor. So my question to staff is, what is the intent of what does new small scale mean? Does that mean 2+ units? Does that mean 3+ stories? Can you help us to understand what prohibiting driveways on new small scale buildings mean? I also can think of some examples where you have a driveway into a new multifamily building that goes into a parking garage beneath that building that's built into the ground. So could you help me understand?
Mr. Mogush, and before you begin, I just want to recognize that we've been joined by Councilmember Warsame. Please proceed.
Vice President Jenkins, Councilmember Palmisano, the term small-scale residential buildings as written in this action step, under it's action step G, under policy 5, is intended to be consistent with the language used in the description of the built form districts. And that term, small-scale residential, shows up in the built form districts interior 1, 2, and 3. So where those built form districts are referring to small-scale residential buildings, presumably the zoning code that results from this document in the future would treat the driveway issue according to this action step the same way. There's obviously a lot still yet to be determined by the council later on when the zoning update is considered and completed. But that's how I read that action step.
So if I may summarize and ask you to confirm, Mr. Mogush, you mean that this would be prohibiting driveways for new residential buildings in interiors 1, 2, and 3. This does not necessarily prohibit driveways in corridors.
Vice President Jenkins, Councilmember Palmisano, that's how I read that, yes.
Okay, thank you. I do think this is a good amendment. I appreciate Commissioner Rockwell's work on it. I do think there's still something to be developed for corridors in some other way. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Kano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm wondering if Councilmember Johnson could build off of his comment regarding, I think, was it 10? No, I'm sorry, that was Councilmember Palmisano. 29, thank you. Here we go. So at first blush, when I read this text by Commissioner Kronzer, it actually sounds really good for areas like mine that struggle a lot with crumbling infrastructure and sometimes blight, with unresponsive landlords, with a lot of crime and safety issues that kind of take over the commercial corridor in the evening, and where city standards on what public lighting is available doesn't meet the need of the neighborhood. And then I'm asked them to rely on MPD mobile cameras to provide that extra lighting or oversight. So I'm just curious, I like the way it reads now, and I wasn't sure what you were saying was kind of what it was in conflict with. So I'm talking about number 29.
So, Madam Chair, should I respond to that?
Councilmember Johnson, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we have an entire policy section on lighting that I think encapsulates the goals that Councilmember Kano is looking for. Just by way of example on this, when they talk about during all nighttime hours, there are best practices emerging around using technology. For instance, if there's moonlight out, if it's at 3 in the morning, if there's adequate ambient lighting nearby, that you wouldn't have necessarily a minimal level of lighting. And I think we want to have the flexibility to adopt the best practices that get towards the goals that Councilmember Kano is talking about having adequate levels of lighting so that our streets are accessible to individuals, so that they're able to get around, so that we're having, for instance, improvements in a person's sense of safety without actually, by the way, I've read like a 350-page book on lighting policy if anybody's interested. It's fascinating stuff, but if you, for instance, have glare off of lights from structures, those can actually create difficulty seeing other individuals at night, perhaps. Or for instance. And so there are instances where too much lighting, for instance, can cause safety issues itself. In fact, we oftentimes, when we go by gas stations at night, you'll see all of these big lights under the canopies, and individuals, once they pull out of the gas stations, usually for several minutes after, are actually at higher risk of accident because their eyes have adjusted to the higher level of light at nighttime.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to point out two things the Planning Commission added here that I think are really important and not overlooked but not highlighted enough. Item number 30, require new developments to preserve existing mature trees in the public right-of-way. I probably would put a period after that not say we're reasonable or feasible, because we're always going to hear it's unreasonable and unfeasible to save an existing mature tree. But the truth of the matter is an existing mature tree is worth 100 times what a new young tree would be. And so I'm glad Mr. Magrino brought this up, because we see this time and time again where trees are considered a problem for development, and cutting them down has just seemed like no big deal. And actually, from an environmental sustainability perspective as well as a natural environment perspective, I think it's important for us to value those existing mature trees as much as we can. I also want to commend Mr. Rockwell and Mr. Kronzer on putting together some very strong language surrounding downtown over two areas. One that has to do with supporting street-level retail businesses, which is an ongoing problem in downtown, where even new development will put in a gigantic lobby in order to make the retail spaces smaller or to not have as much retail. In addition to that, there's not great wayfinding as it pertains to the Skyway system, and if we want the Skyway system to succeed, there has to be good wayfinding in it, and so I appreciate their very thoughtful response on both of those issues.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also wanted to speak to item 29. I agree with Councilmember Cano, and so Councilmember Johnson, I would really like to be able to see information from this book that you spoke of around the public safety aspect of it, around lighting policy, and the reason why is because much the same as Councilmember Cano spoke to, as somebody who represents an area that has high crime rates, I think that all of my constituents would say, yes, we would like to have minimal lighting requirements for folks to be able to feel safe when out in the community. And if we were to not have that, I think that a lot of Northsiders would feel, and I would imagine folks across the city would feel that their safety was not being taken seriously. And so I just wanted to make that request from Councilmember Johnson so that I'm able to get that information and be able to move forward feeling comfortable beyond this. Thank you.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to sit down with Councilmember Cunningham after this. I mean, it's pretty interesting stuff. I mean, oftentimes when you're, for instance, lighting, if you well light an area outside at 3 in the morning, if there's not somebody out there to watch that area, typically all you're doing is helping an individual, for instance, who might be trying to burglarize a building, giving them adequate light to see what they're doing. And I would really just say I pulled up the policy number 12 on lighting right now, and making sure that lighting contributes to safety is one of the goals of this. And I think it's a well-written chapter or a well-written policy. And I think staff did a great job with it. And I would just say, if there's something that's not being captured there in that policy around safety, then let's work together over this coming time before we actually take up the final version. We can put an amendment through at that time.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Jenkins. In my reading of Policy 12, responding to Councilmember Johnson, I don't see policy that explicitly places some responsibility with homeowners, property managers, landlords, and business owners in the way that this amendment does. And I actually think that's a really important thing. I'll say that students in Dinkytown, one of the most important things that the Minnesota Student Association has brought to the council as their big priority has been lighting in areas that get very dark around Dinkytown and create areas of unsafety. And so I think, similar to Council Members Cano and Cunningham, I think one of the things that we've seen is that there needs to be some priority on this. And I think paired with Amendment 28, which educates homeowners, property managers, landlords, and business owners about best practices around efficiency, around dark skies policy, around non-glare, et cetera, I think these are very appropriate amendments, and I'm going to support leaving them in as they are.
Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to shift attention to number 37 and number 38, and perhaps a question for staff and our council members working on the, I believe there was a racial equity amendment that might be coming up later on today. So for number 37, for those of us who have been active in advocating for a North-South Greenway and who actively participate now in the Midtown Community Works Partnership that engages the Midtown Greenway and other governmental partners, I'm just curious if this amendment language is connected to a broader set of directives around also engaging additional government partners, because so much of the time when we try to continue to build and maintain a network of bikeways, including greenways and protected bike lanes, we have to engage the county, or we have to, for example, engage the railroad authority. So I'm just curious if this is connected to something that gives a nod to that additional engagement of other jurisdictional partners who are often key in allowing to unleash the city's deep appetite for bikes and multimodal transportation. So that's one question, then I have another one.
Mr. Mogos.
Jenkins, Councilmember Cano, there is a policy in the transportation section of the draft plan that talks about those important interjurisdictional partnerships, both for the purposes of planning and programming as well as funding. So that is addressed elsewhere.
Beautiful. And then for number 38, supporting Metro Transit's efforts to install higher quality infrastructure. The addition, I believe, of the language here is "and new development." Some of our wards don't have as much new development as others, and so I'm just curious about how a racial equity analysis can be inserted here, or is it connected, or do you feel like the racial equity language that might be coming through later in the discussion would would kind of, I guess, like impose itself onto this sort of implementation sentence in terms of understanding that, for a couple of years now, Metro Transit has decided to acknowledge some of the racial inequities in the public transit infrastructure and has started to address those. And there have been new shelters and better lighting and heat installed in some of the areas that are used by a lot of people of color and low-income residents. So I'm just curious about how we're going to make sure that this kind of new development language in relationship to public transit also has an acknowledgement of a racial equity lens, and if we need to actually amend this further, or if there's or if the racial equity language that a few other, I think, council members were working on will sort of trump this and provide that as a guiding tool for this, for number 38.
Mr. Mogos.
Vice President Jenkins, Councilmember Cano. In terms of, I'd like to, in terms of the racial equity language that will come up later as a proposed amendment from council members, I'd suggest deferring to that discussion when that comes up. I do want to point out, however, that in this instance that you're talking about, Councilmember Cano, where development isn't happening, but there's still a need to make improvements to the public realm, including, for example, transit shelters. There is a policy called Public Realm. I don't know off the top of my head what number it is, but the Public Realm policy has some provisions in it that are about proactively looking at the city as a whole and identifying those places where such improvements are needed and where other major projects aren't happening, such as a street reconstruction or such as a private development project on private property, and to make sure that those improvements are planned for and implemented, the details of which will be identified in the Transportation Action Plan update currently underway by Public Works.
Okay, I'll wait and see until we get into the discussion about the racial equity amendment, and then we can see if maybe by Wednesday we might need to tweak this language or not, but I'm happy to keep the discussion going.
Thank you. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I had put myself in queue to talk about the lighting issue, and I might suggest for future items that we treat the discussion more like we do a committee agenda, so that we take up sort of each item and then vote on it. If possible, it may not be possible. But so I would also support leaving the lighting amendment from the Planning Commission in as it stands, but I could also suggest an amendment that would be striking the word all. So rather than encourage all homeowners, et cetera, it would just say encourage homeowners, property managers, landlords, et cetera. And I think because that would still meet the spirit of the intention of this, which is to focus, I mean, this would give the Planning Commission or staff the ability to do what many of our colleagues have suggested, which is, write a policy that would talk about where we would require certain types of lighting or negotiate project by project to incorporate lighting into corridors where we are concerned about safety. I don't think the intention here was that literally every single house in Minneapolis is contributing in that way. So that was an offer of an amendment that might help meet the intention but clarify the kind of scale or scope. And then to Councilmember Kano's questions about the race equity amendments, Council Vice President and I decided after discussions with race equity staff and planning staff to focus our changes in the implementation chapter rather than going policy by policy and inserting race equity into a number of the policies where we could have strengthened it that way. I know a number of council members are working on things specific to race equity as well in their own wards or citywide. And so that is where that language will land. That certainly doesn't preclude going through specific policies and adding that language, but that is just the approach that we chose to take after many meetings and discussions with those two groups of staff.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hopefully I can just suggest compromise in language to address my colleagues' concerns. I would say on item 12G, or policy 12G, that really, I think, encapsulates both the private and public side of things. It says, update city regulations to reflect best practices, best available practices related to dark skies and the environmental benefits of strategic lighting management. But if my colleagues are interested in keeping item number 29 in, I think in the spirit of compromise, we could amend that, both incorporating Council President Bender's suggestions and then striking the words during all nighttime hours and just replacing them with consistent with best practices. That way we'll have it say, encourage homeowners, property managers, landlords, and business owners to maintain a minimal lighting level along public ways consistent with best practices, which I think is in the spirit of what my colleagues have said in terms of wanting to keep this in, and strikes the right balance in allowing us the flexibility to implement along with best practices.
So you're withdrawing your motion to pull item number 29.
I would put forward this motion to amend item 29 to incorporating Council President Bender's changes and my suggestion.
Thank you. And so in the spirit of Council President Bender's suggestion, we will consider item number 29 with the amendment language striking the word all and striking all nighttime hours and replacing them with consistent with best practices. Is there any discussion? Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. And that item carries. Next, we will vote on the motion to accept the Planning Commission's amendments. And the clerk will call the roll.
Councilmember Kano.
So we're voting on the whole packet now, correct?
Yes.
So I would like to say yes to all except number 43, and I'd like to have time to talk to colleagues about that one. So yes on all except 43.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Wright.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Warsami. Is absent. President Bender.
Aye.
Chair Jenkins.
Aye.
Councilmember Warsami.
Aye.
There are 13 ayes on all items except number 43 has 12 ayes, 1 nay.
That motion passes, and those items have been approved and will be incorporated as amendments to the draft 2040 comprehensive plan. Next, we will consider those recommendations from the Planning Commission that have been identified by a council member as requiring further modifications before being acted upon as potential amendments. These recommendations are included in the third CPC packet, which the clerks have distributed, and is titled CPC Amendments Packet Number 3. Again, the intent here is to go through each of these to consider the further modifications that are being proposed by one or more council members to the original recommendations submitted by the Planning Commission. And I will just pause to give everyone a chance to review this packet. And so I will move the third Planning Commission recommendations packet, which modifies amendments that have been acknowledged by council members. And do I have a proper second? Thank you. And any discussion? The chair recognizes Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I might have missed this instruction earlier, but I noticed that two of these have a bold green highlighting, number 9 and 10, and I just wanted clarification about what that actually means and how to interpret that.
The green highlighting, you'll see this in some of the packets that are forthcoming later in the meeting as well. The two that are grouped together there amend the exact same language, and if they were both approved by the council, would not provide clear direction to staff on exactly how to make the edit in the plan. So the council will need to reconcile those two council member proposed amendments, either by choosing one or working together to amend to find one common amendment.
Okay. So with that understanding, 9 and 10, which don't necessarily look like they conflict with each other to me. It looks like it could be part of one action step, or potentially there could be two separate action steps. One, we're encouraging retailers and manufacturers to reduce and eliminate packaging. That could be done with incentives, with educational programs, with other things going on. And a second option we could do is explore additional ways to disincentivize or prohibit disposable packaging, containers, and carry-out bags. I actually think we could pass both of those, and staff could have them as two separate action steps. Or if I'd also be open to putting and make it one action step, but I really think it would be easier if they're two action steps. So with that in mind, I think leaving them both approved as two action steps is in keeping with the motion that was made and seconded, and I just wanted to clarify that for folks, and also wanted us to all get a training in on what the dark green highlighting means. Thank you.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a comment or perhaps a friendly amendment to amendment number 10 from Councilmember Gordon. At the end it says, and carry-out bags. Carry-out bags, to me, and I think to the public, mean any type of carry-out bag. I think the intention behind this was single-use bags. And I'm curious if that's true, and if so, would that be a friendly amendment?
That would be a friendly amendment.
Could we do that then?
Second.
So Councilmember Gordon and I agree that the amendment text for amendment number 10, instead of saying and carry-out bags, meaning of any type, would say and single-use bags.
The disposable is already there.
Did you want to? Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you. I wanted to get some clarification on that because from what I'm seeing, it says disposable packaging containers and carry-out bags. Wouldn't the disposable cover the rest of that phrase as well? Or do we need to put disposable packaging, disposable containers, and single-use bags? Because I read it as disposable containers or packaging containers and carryout bags all as one descriptor.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to note a procedural point, which is that I think we have a lot of agreement here on the general policy direction, and at this point we are talking about sort of wordsmithing policies where I think there's unanimous agreement within the council. So I don't have a strong opinion about the specific language that we use, but I'm watching the time and just want to make sure that we have time to get through all of the very thoughtful amendments that everyone has brought forward today. So I wonder if it's these two items, item 9 and 10, that need to be pulled off, perhaps we could take them up separately. Perhaps Councilmember Gordon could offer something. I'm trying to think of how we can sort of make sure that we get to all the really important items in today's meeting, and probably don't have time to spend like a half hour on particular wordsmithing items.
So we do have a motion to amend number 10, item number 10 by Councilmember Palmisano. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say nay. And that carries. And on the original motion, I have Councilmember Cano in discussion queue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm wondering if Councilmember Johnson would accept a friendly amendment to item number 8, which currently reads, implement mandatory recycling program. Maybe I should say programs, but that's not my amendment. Implement mandatory recycling program that includes audits, education, and eventually penalties for non-compliance. And I would like to add in multiple languages right after the word program. And then I would like to add outreach in front of the word education. So it would read, implement mandatory recycling programs in multiple languages that includes audits, outreach, comma, education, and eventually penalties for non-compliance.
On the Cano amendment, I have in queue for discussion Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate my colleagues' recommendations. I think that's a great way to improve the language.
Thank you. So all those in favor of the, oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Goodman.
I'm sorry to jump in here, and I have no objection to what Councilmember Cano is suggesting, but I want us to think about when we look at the statistics for who actually recycles and who doesn't, it's people who don't have any other problems in their lives who are able to recycle, and it's generally people who have a lot going on who can't recycle. So if we can't educate them, we're going to turn around and penalize them, fine them. Seems like that would fall disproportionately on people of color, people who are renters, people who live in buildings that don't have adequate composting or recycling. I would urge us to take a step back and think about who that could affect before we just jump on, penalize people who don't comply. Because I assure you, people in my ward probably have a pretty high compliance rate, and I don't want to guess where the compliance isn't good, but I doubt it's in Kenwood. So, I mean, if we're talking about racial equities, I would think that education might make a lot of sense, but penalties for noncompliance seems to me as though it would hurt the people who are least able to recycle in the first place.
Is that an amendment or?
Chair, no, that's just simply a comment.
Okay.
If someone else agrees, they might want to say something, but if not, it's cool.
Councilmember Ellison.
Yeah, I would like to actually make an amendment to erase the eventually penalties for noncompliance. I think when we're thinking about, there's like a movement to eliminate bail. There's a, we're trying to figure out how to not give people parking tickets. We're trying to figure, we're already in the progress of trying to figure out how we're not sort of adding a tax onto people who are already facing some financial difficulty, and then sort of, kind of getting them in this spiral, this downward cycle. I could see us here in the next couple of years saying, like, hey, penalizing people for not recycling is actually just creating more problems than it's solving. So I agree with Councilmember Goodman. I would like to I would like to strike that from item 8.
So your amendment would just read, implement mandatory recycling program in multiple languages that includes audits and education.
Madam Vice President, if I can maybe insert to help, what I have are 2 separate amendments, and if both are approved, this item shown in number 8 would read as follows. Implement mandatory recycling program that includes audits, outreach, education in multiple languages, and strike the remainder, which was, and eventually penalties for noncompliance.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And so now we have discussion on the Ellison Amendment. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question actually for Councilmember Johnson. Were you thinking that this was residential or commercial?
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham, for the question. I did not clarify that because I think that the council should explore that when looking at implementing the program, and I'll also add in just a clarification that penalties may not necessarily mean fines either. There's different ways to look at that. So, and that's, I can elaborate on that comment at the moment.
So I guess I just have a hard time being able to understand the implementation of single-family home residential audits and then being able to then somehow, like, it makes sense commercially. Like, I think that this could make sense commercially, but I think that within my ward, this would not necessarily help us at the individual level. So to clarify, you are thinking both commercial and residential
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And Councilmember Johnson, did you have further discussion?
Yes, Madam Chair. I would just say on this, the piece is, and I don't want anybody to forget this fact, if people do not recycle, there is a cost to that. It costs less to process recycling than garbage. So when people do not recycle when they can, everybody else is paying that cost. So there is a penalty that is going on to folks. And it's easy for folks with higher income to just pay a little extra for that, but there is a cost that is borne by everybody for that. So I think in the spirit of compromise, if Councilmember Ellison is open to it, maybe we could change the language to say, and explore penalties for noncompliance. But I think it's something worth considering if we're going to be serious about our climate action goals here and our waste goals. We are going to eventually have to take this on. And at some point, if we are going to achieve those goals, we're going to have to consider how we're going to address noncompliance.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I appreciate the discussion. I think actually this idea is pretty consistent with our zero waste plan. I think we could lose this section on eventually penalize, because we have to have the word mandate sitting there. So what the heck does that mean anyway? I also just want to remind folks that right now we have rules and regulations and mandates about the garbage. If you put scrap metal in your garbage, you'll get a little tag, a little citation. If you put car batteries in there, if you put yard waste in the wrong container, you'll get a little tag and a reminder, and there's a mandate about that too. So this isn't a big stretch in what we're doing right now to try to organize our waste and manage it better to protect the city. So I just wanted to bring that up. I'm a little bit ambivalent on this specific amendment because I think when we're mandating it, we'll eventually get down the line where we're going to explore, well, what does that actually mean with your citation? I will say typically what happens now is people get a card with a warning and it's circled, and that takes care of it. So not many people get fines about putting the wrong stuff in there, but we do reserve, I think, some authority to do that, because we actually don't want paint put in with our garbage and sent to the garbage burner and burned. I mean, it's important, I think, for health reasons as well as trying to get to zero waste.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to speak to research about behavior modification. So I, as a special education teacher, was trained as a behavior analyst, and I can say that it is very clear that incentives sustainably change behavior while penalties do not. And so I just want to throw that out there, not just specifically to this, but just as we move forward and how we think about how we relate and how we try to shape and change population level behavior, that we have to also think about it on the individual level, and individually on the individual level, incentives work far more and more effectively. And so I just want us to be really cautious about walking down a similar path of the way that punishment and punitive approaches and strategies, they just don't work sustainably, and whereas incentives do. So as we are thinking forward, of course we want to hold folks accountable, but if ultimately the goal is to change people's behavior, then we have to be taking that in consideration as well.
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. I do want to just acknowledge that we still have a very lengthy agenda, and we have a committee meeting at 1:30 this afternoon. Councilmember Cano.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you, Madam Chair. I do appreciate the language around incentives and more about accountability. And perhaps that means, we all dress up as trees and go in front of the restaurant who hasn't been, recycling and say, hey, what's going on? We got to hold you accountable. But my point here is that the incentive piece is really important, because sometimes when you're talking about some very small, immigrant-owned businesses, making a change on recycling actually is connected to a broader systems need within the business. For example, if you go to Seward Co-op, you'll see that some of the things are color-coded. So like the organic section is like green. And so if at the Mexican grocery store you wanted to have somewhere where the organics are dumped and you wanted to make that green, that means you have to buy 3 new garbage cans to do that. And so there is a broader conversation about how do we shift the culture and the economics of recycling and reuse and organics waste in our city. So I want to say that I appreciate the language around incentivizing and perhaps inserting a word around the word accountability versus the penalties issue.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellison.
I won't belabor this, just to say that this isn't a conversation about whether we should recycle or not. It's just a conversation, as Councilmember Cunningham pointed out, as to whether penalties get us there. And I see this as having the potential of like the worst of the worst, right? We're going to penalize people, and it's not going to get us any closer to our recycling goals. And so that's why I'm sort of going to keep with my motion. I appreciate the compromise, but I would like us to vote on this item as the clerk articulated. So yeah, I'm going to stick with that.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. To expand on what Councilmember Ellison said, this is not only not a debate about whether recycling is good, but it's a debate not just about whether we want to go to penalties, but whether we want to put that in the comp plan. Yeah. And I actually think it makes sense to consider as ordinance, but in the spirit of both time and sort of keeping this document at the level of sort of broad policy vision that we need to, I'm very supportive of Ellison's amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. So, seeing no further discussion, we will now vote on the Ellison amendment. To Cano's amendment, and I would ask the clerk to please read that.
The Ellison amendment strikes language and eventually penalties for non-compliance. The rest would read, implement a mandatory recycling program that includes audits, outreach, and education in multiple languages.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. That item carries. The next amendment is the Cano amendment to item number 8 on the Planning Commission amendments. And I will ask the clerk to please clarify that language.
The language on number 8 would read, implement a mandatory recycling program that includes audits, outreach, and education in multiple languages.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. And that item carries. And now we will vote on the original motion to receive the Planning Commission amendments in packet number 3 as they have been amended by council members, and I will ask the clerk to call the roll.
Councilmember Cano.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye. Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Wright.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Warsami.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
Chair Jenkins.
Aye.
There are 13 ayes.
Thank you. That item carries, and I would just like to pause here and just offer my thanks to the Planning Commission for all of their work and ideas on the comprehensive plan. They brought forward some important and thoughtful proposals to help improve the final plan, and we are very much appreciative of their efforts and engagement over the many years. So on behalf of the entire City Council, I will extend our thanks to the Planning Commission. And with that, colleagues, we have dispensed with all of the recommendations submitted to us by the Planning Commission. It is now time to take up amendments from individual council members. Again, staff have organized these around the 14 goals that are included in the draft comprehensive plan. So goal number 1, reduce disparities. And we will be following the same pattern for each goal area. So I will review that with everyone now. I will ask staff to briefly summarize the amendments listed to each goal area. And then we already have the packets. So when staff has concluded the presentation, I will move the entire slate of amendments in order to put the packet before us for formal consideration. I will then ask if there are individual amendments that need to be separated from the base motion for additional consideration or further modification.
Are these all the extras?
After we have identified all of the proposed amendments that need to be separated for additional consideration or further modification, we will proceed to vote on the remaining items in the packet with a single vote, similar to how we process consent agendas. So we are following that same procedure, and that should be familiar to all of us. One difference is that any further modification that might be proposed will be a second level amendment. So we will need to act on each proposal as it is made. Any amendments that are proposed cannot be further modified. And with that, I will ask Ms. Worthington to summarize the amendments proposed in goal area 1. Ms. Worthington.
Thank you, Council Vice President. Council members, goal number 1 reads, reduced disparities. In 2040, Minneapolis will have significantly reduced economic, housing, safety, and health disparities among people of color and indigenous peoples compared with white people. And there are 12 amendments under this goal area.
Thank you, Ms. Worthington. And I will move the goal area number 1, reduce disparities. Is there a second?
Second.
We have discussion first by Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to call attention to the amendment that I'm bringing forward for Goal 1 itself. The amended language that I am bringing forward is in 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, and safety and health. I just wanted to explain why the current goal as it is, there are two things. First, it centers whiteness as the standard of success. Which is an area in which we don't want to begin our long-term planning, is from Goal 1 from the beginning, centering whiteness as the standard of success. And ultimately, we want all communities, including white folks, to do better than what folks are doing now. We want everyone to succeed. And so this is a way to be able to more clearly name some of the marginalized classes and speak more directly to the issues that we have. In addition to this goal, it would be changed from reduced disparities to eliminated. I think, and then the second component of it is that I think that it's absolutely necessary for us as a council to put our foot down, and that by 2040 we should be seeing disparities eliminated, not reduced. And so we need to set a strong goal for ourselves, much the same as when we talk about climate change. We need to have the same sort of aggressiveness with closing the racial disparities, and do so in a way that lifts up our entire city. So we need to throw the gauntlet down and also say that we are going to eliminate disparities over the next 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to pull item G1.2 for discussion after the vote on the consent items.
Thank you. Are there any further discussion? So, Mr. Clerk, do we need to vote on the President Bender's motion?
Madam Vice President, if there are no other items to pull other than item G12 mentioned by President Bender, then the motion can be made, seconded, and voted to approve the remainder of the packet, and then we can come back to item G12.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The chair recognizes Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. I want to note in G1.8 there is a typo, just fixed institutes to institutions, and I would move an amendment to strike the phrase such as places of worship. I think they're included in cultural institutions, but I don't necessarily want to put that into the language.
Second.
Thank you. So we have discussion on the Fletcher amendment. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate my colleague's attention to the details and his friendly amendment, and I'm supportive of it.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Seeing no further discussion on the Fletcher amendment to item G 1.8. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say nay. That item carries. And next we will vote on the goal 1 of the amended comprehensive plan. And I will ask the clerk to call the roll.
Councilmember Cano.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Wright.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Warsami.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
Chair Jenkins.
Aye.
There are 13 ayes.
So, Mr. Clerk, now do we need to go back to discuss item G 1.8?
Thank you. 1.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This item is about informing residents about land use and zoning changes. And I just had concerns about the language that says by sending out notices to all residents. We've had discussion about this in the past. Councilmember Johnson, when he was on the Zoning and Planning Committee, talked about this. I know Councilmember Schrader and I, having served on the Planning Commission, know how many amendments come through related to the zoning code and the comprehensive plan. And I just have concerns about the commitment that is asking us to make and how we would achieve this goal, particularly considering that when we send out notices, they go to the property owner, not the resident.
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I sent out a notice that we were undergoing this comprehensive plan, I did not send out notice to all property owners. My intent was to send out notices to all residents. It particularly captures renters, and it is inclusive and adds them into this process. So my understanding is that CPED by ordinance keeps a list of every known residents in the city, and I would hope that as we undergo the next steps of the implementation part of this comprehensive plan, that we would seek to involve their voices in this conversation.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I do think it's really important that we try to inform residents when there's going to be zoning changes in the area, but I guess I share a little bit of the concerns of exactly what would this mean when we're doing it. I'm just trying to get some clarity, because if I read it the wrong way, I would think anytime there was any kind of zoning change rippling over after this plan, we'd have to inform all residents.
Right.
And I think that's unrealistic, and that's not really the intention, that anytime we make a future new land use or zoning change as a result of the plan, we'd inform all residents. Like if it's a small thing in Ward 2 and we realized, oh, somebody wants to build there, we're going to now rezone it based on the comp plan. So maybe we need to, if we said impacted residents, or maybe we just need to refine this so there's a little more guidance to ourselves in the future about what it actually means. I definitely think we should inform residents of new land use and zoning changes that the 2040 plan will create, and make it by sending out notices. But I'm more concerned about the impacted residents getting notice than all residents, if that makes sense.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just to echo that, and we do have a lot of robust policies in the comprehensive plan that are related to community engagement, and I think those things are really important, particularly in wards like mine that are 80% renter. We really have to go a long ways beyond mailing something. If you sent a mailing to my ward, you would get a giant number of returns. And as far as I know, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, we've had discussions about this many times over the years. We rely on the property owner list as the one that we give notification to. So in order to reach renters and residents, we rely on neighborhood organizations, on social media, on email, on websites, on all the different ways that we fund $6 million a year in our NCR programs, specific outreach to cultural communities. That is the ways that we are really committing as a city to reach all residents when we make important decisions affecting them. And I agree wholeheartedly that we need to do better, particularly in reaching the more than 50% of our residents that rent their homes. But I would really be concerned if we put, the amount of money that it would cost us to send a mailing to property owners every time we did a zoning change would really overwhelm, I think, those other strategies that we are using to get more diversity in the voices that we're hearing when we make changes to any of our plans or infrastructure.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. I'm wondering if city staff can clarify for us what the current policy is, because my understanding is that if we propose a zoning change, there is some amount of notice within a certain radius, and obviously if we're changing zoning that impacts the whole city. I guess my question is this something that we would be doing already? Is this sort of redundant? Is this adding anything to the notice that's already built into our current city policies?
Ms. Worthington?
Council Vice President Jenkins and Councilmember Fletcher. The notice is driven by the Municipal Planning Act and state law and our local ordinance. State law requires a publication notice for any zoning code change, whether it's a text change or a map change. as well as a mailed notice to property owners when it involves an area of 5 acres or less only. Our ordinance builds on that minimal notice requirement. It includes the publication notice, a mailed notice to registered neighborhood groups, and then the similar mailed notice when it involves an area of 5 acres or less. Typically, that would be represented by someone applying to rezone a specific parcel. So for a large scale of amendments that we would enter during a zoning implementation phase that have been initiated by the city council, in this case the city, the only legally required notices would be the publication notice and the mailed notice to registered neighborhood groups. However, it's my understanding that in the past where there have been rezoning studies and a large number of rezonings done over a large area, it has been CPED's practice to give individual property owners mailed notice. So you can always build on notice. We can always do additional notice as long as we're meeting the legally required minimums.
Thank you. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I kind of see this as something we absolutely have to do. And the fact that a lot of people are saying they didn't know, not everybody, but a lot of people are saying they didn't know means there's been some sort of breakdown in the system. But I don't see this amendment as requiring mail, because it doesn't. It says inform residents of the new land use and zoning changes. So there might be multiple ways to do it. In the advance notice ordinance that Councilmember Schrader and I authored, we required property owners to put up notices in their lobby. As an example, we even provided a template for the notice, so we know we can reach renters. And in the ward I represent, Citizens for Loring Park community 2 years ago went through a complete rezoning of the Loring Park area and Hill, and there are tons of renters in Loring Park, and we were able to get notice via mail by the city to every one of those folks. So it is possible. It's just a question of using multiple different ways of doing it. We probably can use utility bills for some people. We can use mail for other people. We can use our model of advance notice for rental protections for others. I think we just need to simply make a commitment to notify people, and we can, like all of the other thousands of ideas in this comp plan, they're not all going to be law tomorrow. Someone suggesting that, you know, something happens in this plan, someone's going to have to take that issue up and run with it over the next 10 years. And so it sounds like Councilmember Palmisano has said she's going to run with it and try to figure out how it would happen. I don't think you should count on everyone up here joining you in that effort, but as long as someone's willing to take it on as their issue, we have to have multiple ways of notifying people of zoning changes.
Councilmember Palmisano.
So, in fact, my intent was simply about the implementation phase of the 2040 plan. This was not a forevermore, but because we are taking a very bold approach with rezoning an enormous part of our city, and that I do believe that that has been a factor in the frustration and anxiety as voiced by constituents here through the process. I also, as I was just conversing with Councilmember Gordon, I do not believe that zoning changes need to be sent. My understanding of how we implement this, per the long-range planning director, is that we will do this by geography. Whatever geography that is, if that is by ward, if that is by segment, if we parcel this out by ward and we go through the implementation phase of the 2040 plan by ward, then I would anticipate that we would be looking to send all residents in that ward a piece of mail was my intent, though, as you pointed out, sending doesn't necessarily mean mail, that we are going through this process. As the city attorney suggested, this is something that in practice we have done, but because there is a 5-acre rule and anything larger than 5 acres does not require this notice, I would like our commitment to inform residents of this implementation of the 2040 plan. I do believe it was missed. It is a lesson learned from the beginning of this process.
I see Councilmember Goodman in queue again. Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For me, the way that I connect to this specific amendment is that If you recall, when we had our public hearings on the comp plan, there were very, very few people of color that came to testify, and a much smaller amount of immigrant folks that were able to engage with this. So I'm looking forward to working with Councilmember Palmisano on looking at how we inform people about not only the changes, but not only that the change is happening, but what that change means. I met with an urban planning professor at the Humphrey and had a meeting there with also the mayor's staff member, Sean Pierce, and another researcher from Cura. And one of the things that we talked about is that all of this information is just so hard for the regular person to capture in a very accessible and quick manner without having to pour themselves into pages and pages of information and maps and coding and language that they may not understand in just plain English, much less what do we do with our multilingual communities and our immigrant communities that may also be facing similar challenges in getting through to access the information. So I think we do need to figure out how we communicate these important decisions that we're making about how our city is going to grow, who's going to benefit from that growth, who's going to benefit from that density, how is that being managed, how is that being shaped, because there's a lot of conversations that relate to wealth building, wealth inequities, racial justice, racial inequity within all of that world of knowledge that a lot of people don't even know is happening. So my concern is along similar lines, but perhaps looks in a different way, in that I'm interested in seeing some of this information again be distributed in multilingual manners, being shared in a way where folks not only are given the notice of here's the day the change is going to happen, here's the time, and here's what the landlords are going to be receiving in the mail, but more about, well, what does that mean for my neighborhood? What does that mean for my community? What does this actually mean for the long-term viability and health of our city? So I connect with this a lot, and I know it's going to be heavy work to unpack all of those layers of outreach and civic education that the city should be doing. But I'm looking forward to digging in. So thank you, Councilmember Palmisano, for bringing this up.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to move an amendment that reflects the discussion we've had, which is to strike by sending out notices to all residents and adding communicating through multiple methods in multiple languages, which I've emailed to the clerk and to the council. So the final version would read, inform residents of new land use and zoning changes in the 2040 plan by communicating through multiple methods in multiple languages.
Thank you, Council President Bender and Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do need to speak against this amendment because I believe that this is what we tried to do with the comp plan this year. I think that the proposed language covers exactly how we've been communicating this 2040 plan this past year. And what I am suggesting here in this amendment is that we need to do something specific and something different. I had been next in queue, and I had tried to modify the amendment to something that I think would address the concerns that were previously stated.
Okay, so Councilmember Gordon? Did you want to speak to the Bender amendment?
Yeah, I think we're getting closer with the Bender amendment, but I also am wondering if this might be a great candidate for setting aside and bringing back at our next meeting, because it's so complicated. And I also think that the idea of mailing or sending out to residents, I mean, there's pieces of all of this. So that was just my thought, because I'm starting to get a little bit overwhelmed by this one particular amendment, and I know we have a lot more to cover. I'm not going to move to table it, I guess, but a lot of people nodded their heads when I said maybe this is something we should set aside and bring it back next meeting.
Councilmember Rank.
I just would echo what Councilmember Gordon had just suggested. I think when we do find that we're close on something and it needs a little bit of more detailed work, that's best done maybe off the dais and then represent it on the dais when we've had that time. So I'm just echoing what Councilmember Gordon had suggested. And I would move to table it if that's the appropriate motion. No.
So we have a motion to table the proposed amendment. Is there a second?
No, Madam Vice President, I'm so sorry. We're 3 deep at this point, and so if the consensus of the council is to waive the amendment or the alternate language that the council president proposed, which are the first two, and to postpone this until the second markup session, which is on December 5th, then you could, as chair without objection, put that motion in front of the council right now, and we would take this off of the agenda, proceed to the next goal item, which I believe is number 2, and then between now and the second markup session, this single item could be addressed.
The chair moves that we accept Councilmember Wright's motion to table this item for further discussion and bring to our second markup. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item carries, and we are back to the comp plan amendment goal number 1, number 2. All right. We will take up individual motions to that plan, and I am going to ask Council President Bender to take over chairing the meeting.
Sure.
For a restroom break.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you.
All right, as council members are looking over the 7 items, please feel free to add yourself in queue if you would like to pull any items. I would like to pull item G2.1 for discussion. And I'll pause and see if there are any other council members in queue to pull items before we vote on the rest. So I will go ahead and move 2 through 7 and see if anyone else wants to pull. Seeing none, clerk, please, is there any discussion on items 2 through 7? I don't see any. Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Kano.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Wright.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Warsami. President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That carries and those are adopted. That brings us back to item 2.1. I will just note that while I agree with the spirit of this, I just want to note that this would be creating a height minimum of 15 stories in a district outside of Councilmember Johnson's ward. So I just wanted to voice some concern with that change. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I sent this over to staff, I noted I had a comment which was basically a question on this, and so honestly, if folks aren't comfortable with this, we can leave it. The whole reason I brought this forward and the question to staff was basically if we have in, I believe it's Transit 30, a minimum of 10 stories, why would we not have a slightly higher minimum in Core 50? It's not my ward. It was just an idea, and so I'll do whatever people want on it. I'm not attached to it.
Thank you. Councilmember Goodman, then Fletcher.
I don't support this. So we've had a lot of very good, positive conversations with developers about increasing density voluntarily. And it's happened over and over again. I can point to Kraus-Anderson's new headquarters block, to the project that Kraus-Anderson is doing jointly on the block next to them, where they come in with like 6 or 8 stories and we say to them, no way, you're not doing that. And they say, all right, we'll rethink it. I don't think we need to have a mandate. People who are operating downtown know they have the best zoning possible. They can build pretty much as high as they want, and they work towards doing that. I don't think it's very friendly to businesses to tell them that there's a difference between 10 and 12. But I do think there has to be some minimum. I mean, we can't always be successful in getting them to build big buildings. But somewhere around 10 or 12 makes the most sense, because you have to change your construction type, add additional elevators, and there's an increased cost in that. So I'm good with 10, and I appreciate your intent. I don't think you tried to, do anything bad here. I think your spirit is good, but I think 10 is a good number.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Councilmember Goodman said most of what I was thinking, but I'll just add that because you have to move away from stick building to concrete building, at 6 or 7 stories, we're not going to get any 10-story proposals anyway. So this isn't going to have a lot of impact. And there are a couple of lots in the Core 50 where if we had a 12-story proposal, I'd be pretty ecstatic to see something built there. So I don't necessarily want to foreclose that possibility.
Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. And just extending the comments by both Goodman and Fletcher, I think we have good examples when we want to, very specifically, for very specific reasons, have a minimum that's larger. We've been successful in that, but in a very targeted way. I would say the Nicollet Hotel block would be a great example of having a much higher minimum and getting a much different result, but having that intentionality, knowing that that specific site would support something like that, and anything less would be against our policies and objectives, knowing that there might be some other areas in that broader, lots in that broader area that might be a different challenge. I think this flexibility and our past practice would indicate we could achieve the spirit of Councilmember Johnson's intent while maintaining the insights that the ward council members have expressed.
Are there other comments? Councilmember Cano.
I just wanted to give a nod to this issue that we raised during our strategic planning for the City Council, which was this issue of supporting the local economy by both welcoming and supporting small businesses and workers. And so I just want to make a note on G2.6 that this could be a way where we could add a little bit of language on the workers issue. So regularly review and update city ordinances, policies, and processes to make them friendlier for small businesses and workers. So that's something we could consider for either today or Wednesday. But, I understand that the city does have a pretty clear set of values around supporting workers right now. How we institutionalize that for the long term when council members come and go is the bigger question here, and I just wanted to put that on people's radar.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on comp plan goal number 2.
Madam Vice President, we voted on comp plan goal number 2. The issue before us is item 2.1, which I believe was pulled for possible deletion from this list.
Oh, so sorry. Is there any other discussion on that item? Council President Binder?
For clarity, I'll move to delete this item.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good. Moving on, that motion passes and those items have been approved. We will now move to goal number 3, affordable and accessible housing. And I will ask staff to briefly summarize the amendments to this goal and invite Ms. Worthington to speak.
Council Vice President, council members, affordable and accessible housing. In 2040, all Minneapolis residents will be able to afford and access quality housing throughout the city. 36 amendments.
All right, so I will move goal area number 3, affordable and accessible housing. Is there a second? Second. Thank you, and we will hear from Council President Bender and then Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to pull items 1 and 2 for discussion.
Thank you. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just wondering if Councilmember Gordon will yield to a question. Councilmember Gordon, I asked you this via email too. Have you talked to any housing staff about all these ideas? I mean, did you just like take every idea that you had with regard to affordable housing and toss it into the comp plan? Because there are probably things in here our staff could not do, couldn't support, have too much stuff going on in their work plan already. I'll give you 2 examples. G 3.6, suggesting that affordability should be for 50 years. I'm sure that's like a non-starter. And then there are other things that are already in our unified housing policy that you're kind of just reiterating within the comp plan. And you chair the housing committee, so I'm just wondering what's going on, like, with this.
So I can respond to that.
Councilmember Gordon, yes.
I think I might have emailed you back about the 30 to 50, but maybe it didn't. The email didn't get through yet. Yeah, and there is some pushback about that. So this is where it says we should pursue policies and tools and programs to ensure long-term housing affordability, and the recommendation was such as requiring the maximum affordability term of at least 30 years, and the suggestion was to pursue something along the lines of 50 years. This is a stretch goal. It might even take some state law changes, or who knows, but in 20 years, we can pursue these things. So that was the idea, was to pursue it. And definitely, there's people who come back and say that's going to be really difficult and challenging to do. Might even require us to add some incentives. And as soon as we did create some incentives, even like hooking them up to 40 along the way, we might get to 50. But I wanted to set the sights to pursue that. If that seems like it's too much for the council or my colleagues, I can understand that. And we can keep working on it, even if we say 30 in the comp plan. And I'm all right with that. I think a lot of the other changes are adding some details that were missing when we talked about different kinds of housing. And also lots of things are consistent already with where we're moving with our unified housing policy and plans as well. And so I thought it would be good to include those in the comp plan.
Madam Chair. I just feel like what's happening here is that our staff are completely overwhelmed. They can barely handle the changes that have been proposed. And you have like another 20 ideas in here that are now directing staff around this work plan process to do this, that, and the other thing. And that's what's of concern to me. I mean, suggesting something that isn't even consistent with state law as part of it seems like just a way around your own prescribed work plan that you put in place for the housing staff that they're already drowning in. So, I mean, someone sees this. I mean, I could give you an example of support community-driven innovative housing solutions such as prefabricated and manufactured housing. Well, I can imagine in the more stressed parts of town what they think about prefabricated and manufactured housing. There's already concerns about gimmicks quality of housing. Do people who have concerns about that have to worry that that's going to come forward on a work plan or staff direction because it's been included in the comp plan? This seems to me like a way around all of the gigantic body of work that's happening in housing now. I mean, it seems like you've taken every idea that you ever could think of and put it in here because it's not part of the unified housing policy, the affordable housing work plan, or anything that the housing policy committee is discussing. I worry about how that will affect our staff who are already hugely overworked.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I take to heart Councilmember Goodman's comments, and I think they actually apply to a lot of the amendments that are coming through this process from council offices. I mean, even, for example, G 3.4, which is an idea that I support from Councilmember Palmisano that says establish specific affordable housing goals for all neighborhoods. I mean, I think that's a great idea. The city of Portland has a goal that every neighborhood be affordable to the median income of the city of Portland. In Minneapolis, that would be an enormous shift, but I think it's an aspirational goal that I would support. But of course, it would take an enormous amount of staff work to get to that level. So I think there's a balance to be struck here. Frankly, I think there are a lot of amendments coming from council members today that are, as Councilmember Goodman is saying, are certainly going to take a lot of effort. That said, this is a plan that is going through to 2040, so I think it is a time to incorporate some aspirational ideas. So I'm willing to support, the rest of the items. I did have some concerns about items 1 and 2 here, but taking this as a plan through 2040, understanding that we will have to very carefully consider our staff's workload and work program with a lot of these new additions that are coming.
Thank you, President Bender. Councilmember Connell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I do like a lot of the things that are being proposed here by Councilmember Gordon. For example, the 50 years of affordable housing construction, the maximum affordability term, I think that's wonderful. I want to be able to be visionary with this kind of work and be able to get ahead of the problems we're seeing in other cities. And I think that gets us there. That's more proactive. That's visionary. Cooperative housing, for example, G3.7 is something that's extremely low funded or supported in our city in terms of the financial tools we have available to make it happen. Yet it's one of the most popular and most affordable ways to keep housing accessible to communities. So there's, like a very long wait list for one cooperative housing project in my district, and I would love to see that multiplied throughout the city, because I think a lot of people would be really interested in it, but we just don't have enough prioritization within the institution to really elevate those creative models that are that I think are very viable in certain parts of the city, perhaps more than others. Doesn't mean they shouldn't exist in a robust way. G311, talking about serving the lowest income people in our city. That's a really important value. Aging in place, 3.12. That's actually something that some of our residents, at least in the 9th Ward, who are active in the Senior Citizen Commission or board that we have here at the city, are talking about, because they don't want to live in their single homes anymore. They want to be able to stay in Minneapolis. They want to be able to stay close to public transit, but they don't feel like they have a lot of options where they can do that. And we know that this is a demographic that is going to be increasing in our state, in our region. So I'm curious if there's a way for staff to kind of take a stab at this and look at some of these high-level values and come up with some ideas as to how we can continue to uplift and focus our work on that. And if there are ways that that this work is already being focused, to give us as elected officials and policymakers the peace of mind, because I do think that there's a lot of really good forward-thinking and core values around some of the amendments that I'm seeing here from Councilmember Gordon as chair of our Housing Policy Committee. So I would love to be able to support some of these, because they do resonate with a lot of the issues and needs that are presented by people in my district. And I would like to see us coalesce around how we get there, and because I don't think we're maybe disagreeing on what's on here as much as like the how do we get to some of these values and goals. And perhaps maybe there is some division around 30 and 50, but I would like to see if there's maybe some time that we can take to work on this and bring something back on Wednesday, or if folks want to go through each one of these and vote on them. Yeah, and as Councilmember Reich is suggesting, have staff vet some of these and provide some feedback, understanding that, I think we as a council now have a much larger appetite to really make this affordability issue a core component of the work that we all do.
Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And All of these, I take them in a couple different ways. Like first, I want to echo the concerns of Councilmember Goodman that this is putting a lot on staff. But on that, I will be supporting these for a couple different reasons. First, just to use a different example, like G3, I echo that establishing specific affordable housing would be fantastic. But that's also a conversation I've had with staff already. And they've talked about actually implementing it. It would be a huge burden. And the choice was, do you want to continue working on programs like advance notice, like 4D, things that are happening in the short term that will help, or do you want this really global shift? And I think it has to be an and, but it has to be a nuanced. And why I would be supportive of putting these in the comprehensive plan is also that, the other point, that anything in there, we're going to need council members and staff to jump on. It can be in the plan, but if no one's implementing in 10 years, it doesn't mean a whole lot. I also feel a little bit more comfortable with the Housing Committee's work plan. And you have my commitment that, we want to make sure that we're not overburdening staff. And further than that, I want staff to have the kind of leeway to be able to innovate. We've talked about some of these ideas already, Councilmember, and I think that some of these, they're in there because of that's where we're going. We're talking specifically about prefabrication, being able to talk about putting it in the comprehensive plan so people have an idea that we are on this. We are trying to figure out a way to produce safe and affordable homes for everybody. So thank you very much. I think that that's kind of the best stretch forward, and I'll be supporting it.
Councilmember Gordon, then Cunningham, then Goodman.
Well, I just wanted to say that anything in the comp plan isn't going to impact my work plan of the committee at all. Those things have to get introduced as ordinances and staff directions and something that comes through the process. So these will be things, and some of these are actually probably already appear on the work plan in one form or another, and others don't. Also, they're not necessarily my best ideas that I pulled out anywhere. A lot of them are things that have been in conversations, talking with colleagues here, things that are coming down the line, things that we've been looking at. And I will also note that as chair of the Housing Policy and Development Committee, I think I took the responsibility of trying to look at this part of the plan more carefully. There's certainly a lot of changes under this goal that are appearing here. In the other areas and the other goals, I didn't make very many changes to the plan. So this is somewhere where I took an investment, and you're right, you're going to see my name maybe more in this section than in any of the other sections. And I can appreciate that. Some of these ideas also came from community activists and brought forward through comments through the process of other people reviewing the comp plan and making suggestions. I'm willing to explore and consider changing them. I'd actually be willing to pull the one about the 50 if that seems like it's too much. We could set that aside for now. 30 is a good thing to pursue, and once we get there, we can look at 35 or 40 or something like that. So I think a lot of these are things that we can work for and are good, and I think it actually shows that we acknowledge the challenges and the difficulties that we're facing right now in terms of housing. We need to be creative, we need to stretch, we need to be looking at things we weren't looking at in the last comprehensive plan to look at them now. In fact, one of the clear comments and things we heard from people was, if you care so much about affordable housing, why isn't there more actually in the comp plan? And so I tried to make sure that there was. So I don't know if I want to move to pull the 30-50 off myself, but I'm willing to do that. But otherwise, I would like to see all these things supported.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of points. My first is actually a question for Councilmember Johnson. For G3.26, explore the creation of a public bank to further this goal. I wanted to get clarification if you meant a financial institution or a land bank.
I meant financial institution.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I also just wanted to put out the information for folks, my colleagues, to know that tiny houses are not inherently more affordable. They actually cost about the same as a regular size house. So I want to be careful about us codifying that as an affordable housing strategy. And I would like to actually pull for discussion G3.20, where the amendment is proposing to strike funding for prioritizing funding for rental housing development. I just think we need to have a little bit more conversation about that within the context of fair housing. And so I just wanted to pull that for further discussion.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not suggesting that any of the ideas other than the 50 years of affordability, which is not even consistent with state law, are bad ideas. I'm just simply saying that we're just not paying enough attention globally as a city council with regard to workflow in the housing section of CPED. And I'm hearing it back from staff, and I'm surprised everybody else is not as well. I would suggest that if we're going to have this level of ideas floating out there that people want to take on at any given time, that somebody better have a budget amendment that suggests hiring 5 more people in the housing sector to get some of this stuff done, because everyone is interested in affordable housing. Despite anyone chairing it or serving on the committee, people who don't chair it and don't serve on the committee care about this issue too and are bringing forward items as well, but very few people are actually getting anything done. That is the truth of the matter. We've had a handful of major efforts, but not dozens of them. And that's partially because we don't have the staffing to take on this massive amount of work. And so I would suggest that at a minimum, if we're going to add like 10 new things to the comp plan, that lays out there the expectation that at some point we're going to be doing them and we're going to need the staffing for it. And so I would just urge the chair of the Housing Committee to have a budget amendment with regard to that. So that we don't lose the amazing staff we have who are so overworked that they can't even be off for Thanksgiving. And then I just want to note that did someone pull items G3.1 and G3.2?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. I'd also like to pull G3.33 and G3.35 for further discussion.
All right. Are there any other items that people would like to pull from the goal number 3?
Yeah.
So, items, well, let's ask the clerk.
The items I've identified, Madam Vice President, to be pulled are item G3.1, G3.2, G3.3, G3.5, and G3.20.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. So,
Fletcher's. Yeah, Fletcher's.
yeah, the clerk announced those.
3.33 and 3.35. I didn't hear those.
Madam Vice President, I read 3.3 and 3.5. Mr. Fletcher is saying it's 3.33 and 3.35.
Got it. Sorry. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just again, looking at the time of almost 12:15, knowing that we have 45 minutes left, I've talked with the clerk, and it looks like there is time open on Wednesday morning from 9:30 to 12:30 to continue this discussion. Unfortunately, that is the same day as our public hearing on the budget, which would mean a very long day for council members. But I don't even know if we're going to finish this item by the 1 p.m. time that we need to finish in order to get set up for the committee meeting that starts at 1:30. And I'll also just note, the vast majority of these amendments have come from a handful of council members, and I would really encourage those folks who are bringing a lot of amendments to between now and whenever we have the chance to do the final markup to really talk with our staff and colleagues about these. I mean, I know I have like 4 or 5 things that I worked on that everyone should know about and not be surprised by. So part of the amount of time that this is taking is that there are a couple council members that have brought a very large number of amendments that many people are just seeing now for the first time.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Since no one else will, I'd like to move to delete G3.6. That has to do with the 30 to 50 years. I appreciate those who support that stretch goal, but I think for simplicity's sake, we can pull that one off for now.
So we now have a motion to remove item 3.6. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item carries. Seeing as there's no further discussion on Compan Goal number 3, I will ask the clerk to call the roll, recognizing that items number 3.31, 3.32, 3.335, 3.333, and 3.20 have been pulled for discussion. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Kano.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Wright.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Morsani.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
Chair Jenkins.
Aye.
There are 13 ayes.
Thank you. And then we will discuss each item individually, starting with G31. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have concerns about these two taken together, but also separately as they are. As the draft shifted from staff's initial recommendation to what is before us today, there was a shift down from allowing 4 units across the city to 3, and this would take it a step further to prescribe that those units must be 2 units plus an accessory dwelling unit. Today, accessory dwelling units are not allowed in outside of owner-occupied homes, which I'm not sure is actually legal, but also is creating a problem in parts of the city, again, where we have 50% of our city where people occupy their homes by renting their homes. And so I'm concerned about relying on the accessory dwelling unit as a tool to add housing when it discriminates against renter-occupied housing. And I also think that in the comp plan itself, leaving the restriction as up to 3 units gives flexibility in how that could show up across the city. So in parts of the city where there are larger, older buildings, most of those units would come through in conversions, which may very likely be most appropriate as a 3-unit residential building. And so I think that this is too prescriptive to meet the goal of the comprehensive plan.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to respond to that, and I too am speaking both to 3.1 and 3.2, as I appreciate Councilmember Bender was. The interest here has been to add a homestead requirement to this new Interior 1 district, and what it prevents is large quantities of single-family homes owned by portfolio companies across the city to be able to essentially knock down those perhaps more affordable rental housing units and build 3 units on each of those properties to be rented out. What I think, what I intend to put forward with this amendment, and staff has worked heavily on how this is worded, but it is to start by adding a homestead requirement to the triplex initiative.
Thank you, Councilmember Palmisano. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. I'm a little puzzled by that because it does that in a very indirect way by assuming that we're going to maintain the homestead requirement for ADUs and sort of using ADUs to get that, because it doesn't say homestead in here anywhere. And so I think if that's the intent, it feels like we should probably go about that a different way. And I will say that I do think that there are a lot of old buildings that make a lot of sense for a triplex conversion, and I think prohibiting them from doing that, limiting it to duplexes plus an ADU, could really constrain some good options in a way that I'm not supportive of. So,
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To respond to that, this is about Interior 1. I don't find a lot of buildings in Interior 1 proposed districts across the city to have something that is very convertible to a triplex that isn't already owner-occupied. This is, in working with staff, how both of these amendments are coming forward. And I want to note that something that we did just pass was Councilmember Gordon's Amendment 3.15 that he and I were just speaking about. Was this in conflict? And I don't think that it is. I think it intersects in a way in just the Interior 1 in the furthest away parts of our city to the core.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just given that clarification, I want to just emphasize again my strong opposition to discriminating against rental housing in item 1. And then in item 2, this is even more problematic because it relies on the definition of today, which is again sort of reiterating the problem of moving from this overall statement of up to 3 units to a more specific definition that includes accessory dwelling units. There are parts of the city that are today single-family homes that will be designated Interior 2 or other different designations that I've had many discussions with council members about. So limiting this again to 2 units plus an accessory dwelling unit and discriminating against rental housing in neighborhoods that today have a lot of rental housing is contrary to the goals of this plan in a city where over half of our residents are renters.
Councilmember Palmisano and Councilmember Cunningham.
I'll yield to Councilmember Cunningham's comments first.
All right. Thank you, Councilmember Palmisano and Madam Chair. As someone who has a large amount of Interior 1 in my ward, a concern that I've had around the 3 units is what we have seen historically, which is property management or bad landlords come in, convert units, a single-family home with an attic as the 1 unit, the first floor is 1, and then the basement as another. So essentially, what happened is it densified poor rental conditions, and so in the conversations that I've had, it seems as though the concerns that are being discussed can be addressed with other mechanisms, such as with zoning. For example, one of the ways for us to be able to deal with the specific issue I talked about was that every unit has to have its own entrance, for example, like as a way to help prevent that. And so, I'm just. I hear the concerns around this being a little too prescriptive about what 3 dwelling units looks like, and so I just wanted to put out there that I have some concerns around the potential repercussions of 3 units per lot, but from the conversations that I've had and the feedback that I've received, we'll be able to put better safeguards in place through zoning.
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you. I appreciate Councilmember Cunningham's concerns, but I do want to just strongly assert this is absolutely not discrimination towards renters. This is about local ownership and local wealth building, and not having property in Interior 1 owned by large portfolio companies that have no interest in Minneapolis as a whole. So that's why this is before you this way.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In wards where we currently have many multifamily units that are duplexes and triplexes, thousands and thousands of those are owned by local residents of our city. So there really isn't in any sort of factual way a correlation between small multifamily buildings and absentee ownership. In fact, I think we see the inverse if you look into the details of the data that Regulatory Services has pulled for a lot of our renter protection work. We have many thousands of small residential rental units that are owned locally, and we have many programs in development and in place that are helping support local entrepreneurship and local ownership. So again, not to say that there aren't concerns about the quality of rental properties. Obviously, we've had a huge problem in North Minneapolis with these single family rental properties that we need and are continuing to work together to have better inspections, better building quality, inspections that really focus on the quality of housing for the people who live within them, work that I'm doing along with council members from North Minneapolis. But again, this is about the land use, and it's specifying accessory dwelling units, which are only available for owner-occupied buildings. And so I think, again, echoing what Councilmember Cunningham said, the concerns that are being voiced can be addressed in different ways. And I think the intention here, if you really read the text, is to only allow this flexibility in homes that are owner-occupied. Again, something that I don't think many of us support.
Councilmember Goodman.
So people who live in Interior 1 now, which is kind of like R1, have one house on one lot. And maybe they have an ADU, but even after 3 years later, there's less than 100 of them built. So what folks who live in these areas that I've heard from don't like is having 3 houses on one lot. No one's talking to me about, well, if it's owner occupied and there's one and the other, then 3 is okay. They just don't like 3 generally, and this is not getting at that. If this was just take Interior 2 and make it a duplex, that would be something I could support because I think my constituents want that. But I think what we're doing here is we're trying to differentiate between owner occupied and rental, and that feels a little bit discriminatory towards me, to me. And that's why I don't like it. I would like to see, and I doubt it would pass, an amendment that said in Interior 1 you can only have duplexes. I would support that. That's what I'm hearing. It's a density issue, not a home ownership issue. And I don't think my constituents are trying to differentiate between whether or not there's 3 condos or 3 apartments. Those that don't like it don't like 3. So this isn't solving their problem, and it's kind of making them look like they're discriminatory, and I would say that they're not.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I need to assert again that my intent here is absolutely not to be discriminatory at all. This is absolutely about local wealth building and local investment. I would be happy to retract 3.1 and 3.2 and instead assert something that I don't think will pass but will have been prompted to do, which is to instead take Interior 1 as 3-unit developments down to 2-unit developments to see if there is any support on that on the council. So I guess what I'm saying is I would move a substitute amendment for duplexes instead of triplexes and remove 3.1 and 3.2. In Interior 1 only.
Okay, so we have a new motion to amend in Interior 1 from triplexes to duplexes. And speaking to that is Councilmember Cunningham and Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, right before the motion was made, I was going to check in to see if this might be something that we could pull and discuss further before the next markup, since we're talking quite a lot about it. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. Everybody's been talking about time, so if this seems like it's a big conversation, kind of fundamentally underlying almost like the whole plan, and so it's just a really big conversation, so I just wanted to throw that out there.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, I think we've had a lot of time to contemplate our position on some of these major questions, so I think, you know, if folks really want to table it, I would just caution against leaving too many of the larger decisions till this 3-hour period, since we have most of the goals left to discuss. I would speak against, probably no surprise to anyone, the idea that we restrict the number of units to 2 citywide. I represent a ward that has a number of very lovely 2 and 3 unit buildings, and I can assure you that they are wonderful neighbors. They contribute to our community, and they contribute some of the most affordable housing in my ward and in the city. The second point I would make is that this is the most gentle, incremental, moderate approach that we could take to increasing housing options in our city. When we unanimously, or maybe 12 to 1, something like that, nearly unanimously legalized accessory dwelling units, I think now 4 years ago, we've only seen 100 of those built in the past 4 years. So that did legalize up to 2 units everywhere in the city in owner-occupied buildings only. And so it demonstrates, those numbers demonstrate 2 things. Number one, this is absolutely not the only thing that we need to do to increase housing options and affordability in our city. It is a very moderate and incremental approach. But number 2, that over time we are able to get a number of housing units through this approach of allowing more flexibility for people when they are reconstructing a home or more likely remodeling an existing building. This is a preservation strategy to allow multiple units within the same building in places where we have older housing stock. And overall, it is, again, a very moderate and incremental way for us to increase housing options across our city in all neighborhoods, rather than only concentrating housing in the few neighborhoods that have seen the most growth in the past few decades.
Councilmember Gordon.
Yeah, I don't think I can support this change. I don't have any interior one in the 2nd ward. And it seems like if we carve this out now to preserve kind of the low density in these pockets, we're just going to be reinforcing and exacerbating some of the things that we apparently are trying to change, having to do with the restrictive covenants that were put in place and the redlining and those kinds of things. Secondarily, I haven't had lunch yet, and I'm not sure if I can think clearly about such a major issue and engage in these discussions. But I'm going to have to vote no. I was getting pretty comfortable with the triplex idea, and I also appreciated how it would apply in the outside parts of the city. Those 2 ends that seem to have special protections already, even as interior ones, but also in the interior to areas that cover lots of my ward. And so I think this is a big dramatic change that I haven't had a lot of input on. It doesn't necessarily surprise me. There was kind of some foreshadowing that we might want to look at this or even preserve single-family home zoning as well. But given where we're standing right now, and if the vote's coming up, I'm not going to be able to support this change. And I probably wouldn't support it after lunch either, but
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you. In response to some of the concerns voiced by council members, I need to point out that, at least in terms of the information that I have and the way that I know parts of Interior 1 across the city, I felt that this would provide more affordability because you'd be able to do more retrofitting of existing buildings. You would not be able to retrofit most of the homes in my ward to be a triplex, but you could certainly do that to be duplexes. And another thing that this would address is that I didn't hear a single piece of feedback that said, throughout our process from the public, that said they wanted triplexes and not fourplexes. I heard a lot of, we don't want any. I heard a lot of 3 is not enough. But I didn't once hear from the public, and taking all the public comment that we did, that fourplexes wouldn't work, but triplexes would. There's a lot of floor area ratio problems and issues with the setback requirements that we have in place today, and I hope that we continue in terms of building on most of our lots, which are 40 feet wide. And I truly did feel that this would provide more affordability and reuse of existing structures.
Seeing no further discussion, I will take a vote on the Palmisano duplex amendment in Interior 1. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Any opposed, say nay.
Nay.
That motion does not prevail. The nays have it. And so now we will vote on the comp plan goal 3-1. And I will ask the clerk to call the roll.
Madam Vice President, to clarify, I'm sorry, I think items 3.1 and 3.2 were pulled. The last I understood after the substitute was made is that the original underlying intent was to pull these and allow these to be held over for the next markup session. If not, then the clarification would be needed for us to know the specific direction that we're calling roll on.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. It was my understanding that you seem to be headed in the right direction, that items 3.1 and 3.2 were pulled and substituted with a motion for duplexes. So consequently, there is no need to vote on items 3.1 and 3.2. Is that correct?
If the council wishes this matter to move forward as it is written, there's nothing, I don't have any other amendment being put forward at this point or any action. So we either delete it, we postpone it for further work, or there needs to be an amendment expressed to me that I didn't capture.
I'm gonna open the floor to Councilmember Wright and President Bender. I believe that it was deleted, but maybe Councilmember Wright can shed some light. Is that your intent?
No. But thank you, Madam Vice President. I believe I heard two conflicting things, actually. I heard both pulling it for purposes of entertaining a substitute, but prior to that, there seemed to be some discussion about some element of further time for further refinement to achieve maybe some of the intent that wasn't clear in the language as presented. And my understanding is if it is pulled, something could reemerge that would be a part of that exercise if a council member or council members wanted to do that. I mean, that would be a possibility procedurally, that they're not preclusive.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to be clear, I do not support this as written, and I would move to strike G 3.1 and G 3.2 from what we forward to the next meeting.
Thank you. So we are voting now to strike 3.1 and 3.2 from the 2040 Comp Plan Goal number 3. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay.
Nay.
That item carries and that item passes. And same as, well, I guess, what is the will of the body? Do we want to continue till 1 p.m. or take up goal item number 4 now?
We still have 3 items left that people pulled. G20, G33.
Oh, thank you. I am so sorry. We won't move to goal area number 4. We still have 3 items that have been pulled to discuss, beginning with item
G20.
G20. Is there any discussion on item G20? Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I pulled this for further discussion because While in my ward there is a huge demand and need for wealth building opportunities, and I take home ownership very seriously, I just have a lot of question around the demand of need around housing. I think that there is, from what I have heard, is that folks seem to believe that if we create more rental housing, that takes away opportunities for home ownership, and I think it's possible for us to be doing both. And I think that the city currently, is doing quite a bit around home ownership. So as we are looking at creating a larger supply of rental housing in order to, what we've only seen is in Boston is the only place where we've seen rents actually go down during a housing crisis, and it's because they increased the amount of supply. And so I think that we need to be having a focus on home ownership. That's absolutely a huge issue in my ward and something that I'm prioritizing myself. But overall with the city, if we're thinking about all of the available units, what is the demand that folks are asking for, that need right now, as well as how are we making sure that we are really increasing the supply of rentals so that they are affordable?
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate all of Councilmember Cunningham's points, and I certainly am not here to exclude rental housing developments, but the reason I felt it was important to take on this language and to just have produce more affordable housing while removing the other piece of it was to not limit ourselves as we pursue more options around homeownership, co-ops, other kinds of ideas, and I didn't want to be so prescriptive as to what we would indefinitely prioritize, to always be prioritizing rental versus other kinds of models, for example, a senior co-op. I hope that adds clarification to my intent here.
Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate Councilmember Cunningham pulling us out for further discussion, and in the spirit of that, some of the challenges with the comp plan, and as we're voting on these maps, is that there's theories about what's going to happen, and there are things that we can't control. And so while some parts of my neighborhood are being, the density is being increased, it's not a for sure strategy that's actually going to retain and protect low-income renters and communities of color in the area. It's a nice theory, and I hope it works, but I'm worried that it might not be enough. So I appreciate us discussing whether or not this language should say prioritize funding for rental housing developments. I want to go deeper and say, who builds wealth off of that? Because I can imagine that whether they're threeplexes or triplexes, it's not going to be the Latino families that I know on my block that are going to be building those triplexes or fourplexes, and much less able to purchase them in the future. And so we know folks are being displaced because rents are going up, and we know that our people don't have money to be the owners of those future rental housing developments. So we're kind of stuck, and I feel like one of the maybe more clear strategies that I'm hearing around that might work for low-income renters and people of color who rent is this notion of cooperatively owned housing developments. And so I'd be happy to work with folks on further refining this component. But the way that it reads now, it seems like there's kind of two very different sort of things happening here. It's like we do want to produce more affordable housing, but then talking about what we actually want to prioritize to reach a specific goal. And the goal that I want to lift up is this racial equity goal, and how do we ensure that communities of color are building up the wealth that they need to stay in the city. I don't think that simply saying prioritizing funding for rental housing developments gets us there. I think we need another layer to that. And I'd be happy to work with folks on this to figure out what we can bring back on Wednesday. But at this point, I feel like neither of these two options are specific enough to help address those racial inequities that many of us have expressed interest in solving. So I just wanted to put that on the table because I'm not feeling satisfied with either the amended or the original language.
Councilmember Cunningham.
I would echo what Councilmember Cano said around neither option really feeling like it's getting to it. I also just want to say that right now we are having a really complex question or conversation around how do we navigate with a value of justice in a real estate-based capitalist economy. So that's what essentially we're talking about right now. And renting is inherently a wealth extraction tool. Like that is what it is. It takes money out of communities and it does not go into equity for those individuals. So that's just a bottom line. So that means that at least 52% of people in the city are having wealth extracted. That being said, there also is a huge risk in overemphasizing homeownership as a wealth building strategy in economically vulnerable areas. In 2008, during the foreclosure crisis, a massive amount of Northsiders who were homeowners, first-generation homeowners, first-time homeowners, homeowners of color in particular, got displaced, not only out of Northside, but out of the city in general. And so when we look, and also mortgages. If you're black, you are just inherently going to have a higher rate on your mortgage. So there are lots of factors that are in this, and so wealth building and wealth extraction are really complicated when we're talking about a real estate-based economy. I would really like for us to pull this off for further conversation. I don't think that either are necessarily bad, but I think though that and again, this is in the context of fair housing, just to point that out too, that this is a part of fair housing. So how does all of that fit together? And I don't know if either one really gets to it. So we're having a pretty big conversation though right now, just about like how do we make things really work within a real estate-based capitalist economy while also holding our value that housing is a human right as well.
Mm-hmm. Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Good conversation. I'm actually supportive of how this amendment would read, not because it's against rental housing or specifically would target any sort of type. It basically says we have a shared goal, broadly speaking, and a broad statement and a broad document like a comp plan that says we want to produce more affordable housing. The complexities that have been raised in conversation by colleagues just now just sort of underscore the ability to have flexibility, to bring in context, to be opportunity driven, and to use as many tools in the toolbox as possible, particularly underutilized ones, as suggested, different types of cooperative housing. We already have a preponderance in practice for prioritizing the funding for rental housing because those are our partners and our tools and our resources. It's just how we've structured it to date. And so in striking it, I don't see that as a strike against rental housing, certainly not in practice, but it actually just says we are going to be opportunity-driven, multifaceted in our approaches, and a lot of that will be to be determined as we work through the complexities that have been well articulated today.
All right. Councilmember Gordon and Councilmember Connell.
I just thought I would note that I'm comfortable supporting this. Councilmember Reich actually expressed a lot of the sentiments. Taking that prioritization off will just mean that we can be more flexible and nimble moving into the future. We can certainly decide as a council when and where to prioritize investments in rental housing and also to prioritize investments in other things that might come along. So I'll be supporting it.
Councilmember Connell.
I just was curious if staff had any response to address some of the concerns that we're expressing around prioritizing language that seeks to prioritize funding for specific types of housing. So I understand Councilmember Reich's point is that, you know, if we just say produce more affordable housing, we can all agree on that. That's awesome. I think that we took it to the next level when we started unpacking kind of what that means through the adoption of this comp plan as we're incentivizing density and trying to promote it at the same time that we're trying to meet our city's racial equity goals. So is there another section in the comp plan that staff can point us to that would address or speak to some of these ideas, concepts, values that we just discussed here? Staff, either.
Mr. Mogul.
Anyone?
Vice President Jenkins, Councilmember Connell, I can offer just one quick thing, which is just to point out that there is a whole policy area in the draft plan is about the production and preservation of affordable housing and deals with a lot of subtopics under that, many of which I heard in the discussion just now.
Thank you. Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I myself will be in favor of tabling, having a longer discussion as brought up by Councilmember Cunningham. And I think just listening to Councilmember Cano and Councilmember Cunningham, it's important to think of housing as a spectrum. Some people don't have access to affordable rental or rental at all. Some people don't have access to home ownership. And if we're going to think about how everyone has safe, affordable, and stable housing throughout the city, we need to be prioritizing and making sure that we have affordable housing. I think as we start to get more specific beyond, produce more affordable housing, it's important to take the time to be specific because what hasn't been brought up is we have some of the worst racial disparities as it comes to home ownership. But that also number is reflected as we go get into rental by households that are cost burdened, and that means just who's paying too much for their rental. I thought Councilmember Cunningham had a great comment about like how is wealth being built, and are we cutting off some citizens of Minneapolis from building that wealth and having the opportunities that should be available to all.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a comment more general than specific to this, but I think given that we're going to have another session of markup and then the COW meeting and the council meeting to come, I just kind of wanted to reiterate that the council members who are bringing a large number of amendments, I'm not sure if they've had the chance to check in with like the housing staff that manage our affordable housing programs, but if not, I would really encourage it between now and the next time that we have a chance for discussion, because I don't know why, for example, the second phrase was in the sentence as recommended by staff, but they may have had a reason or they may have some suggestions about how to better refine and capture. And again, I would, in this particular case, I know that the housing staff had the chance in the draft plan to work with the long-range planners to provide comments, but I'm not sure that they've had a chance to review or have seen the amendments that are coming from council offices.
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Staff has seen it. That's why it's in this document. It's because staff has seen and helped us with this language. The reason I have to bring this forward is because it currently has this second piece that just says that we're trying to prioritize funding for rental housing developments instead of other kinds of options. So with your permission, I'd like to just call the question on this because I feel there are other things that we're going to need more discussion on, and this seems pretty minimal. If instead there's will by somebody else to make a motion to table it, I'm happy to yield to that.
There is a motion on the floor to call the question. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Say nay. That item carries. With that, we are now voting on striking 3.20 from the comp plan. Was that your intent, Councilor?
Madam Vice President, the last motion I heard was proposing to postpone further consideration of 3.20 to the next markup session. That was what was pending when Councilmember Palmisano then said call the question. Calling the question would be on what I took to be several council members saying postpone this for further consideration.
That wasn't my intent, Madam Chair. My intent was to move the underlying motion, call the question on the underlying motion. I guess I didn't take Councilmember Schrader's comments, which were supportive of tabling it, as an actual motion.
Neither did I. If someone wants to move that.
I so moved.
I assumed that's what Councilmember Cunningham, who brought it forward, had proposed to do.
So there's now a motion to table item 3.20 until the next markup session, which will be Wednesday, November 28th at 9:30 a.m. All those in favor, I'm sorry, Councilmember Gordon.
So we just had a motion to move approval of item 3.20, and we never voted on that. We voted to call the question on that, and now we're moving to motion to table. Is that right? I mean, the motion that I heard coming from my colleague here was moving approval of G 3.20. Call the question on that, and we did. But
which was my understanding as well. The interpretation by the clerk was that there was a motion prior to that to table the discussion. Is that correct?
Madam President, it was my interpretation when Councilmember Cunningham said he would support postponing this item. There were several council members who spoke in favor of that. I assumed that was the motion pending. If that is incorrect, the motion was already taken on Councilmember Palmisano saying she would move to call the question underlying on the motion.
Yeah, my understanding was there was conversation about tabling, but never a motion. I've heard several council members speak to the idea of tabling, but no one made a motion. And a motion that we did have on the floor was to call the question on the original motion, which is what I thought was we were voting on, and the chair will recognize Councilmember Cunningham.
So I'll take responsibility. It was my intention to move that officially forward, but I did not make an official motion, and I recognize that. So let's pretend that didn't happen.
So the question is,
it's happened in preschool all the time.
To
snacks to the
strike item 3.20. Is that?
I believe it's to approve.
Or to approve? Okay. So, maybe we should do a roll call vote on that item for clarity.
Councilmember Cano.
Can I have the clerk please clarify the motion before?
The motion is to approve item 3.20.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Wright.
Aye.
Schrader.
No.
Warsami.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
Chair Jenkins.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes, 1 nay.
That item carries. The next item for discussion is G33.
We got no time.
Council President Bender.
Madam Vice President, just so noting the time, I know there are still 2 items left here in this goal, and then 9 more goals, I believe, for discussion with a large number of amendments in each. I know that our intention is to adjourn this meeting to another session that will give us 3 more hours. The morning of Wednesday, November 28th. So I just want to note that I think we could try to take up 1 more, or we could potentially just adjourn at this time. And the next committee starts at 1:30.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. I wanted to get some clarity on this because many of the housing forms that are being built in my ward are housing forms that have a hard time getting natural light happening in them. If you're doing a warehouse conversion, for example, in the North Loop, it's often going to be true that it's a fairly long, narrow apartment that doesn't necessarily have a ton of access to natural sunlight, and frankly, passing more regulations making it harder to build those would be extremely unpopular with a lot of people who really love that form of housing, who love row houses and townhomes and other kinds of things that don't necessarily have windows on all sides, but that's a really great way to add some nice livable density. So I guess I'm curious to hear if you think that those housing forms are in conflict with this, and if you can name a design standard that you feel like currently does not maximize access to direct sunlight that you would like to see changed.
I appreciate my colleague, Councilmember Fletcher, asking about the intent of this. My intent is not to tie anybody's hands with this, not to try to make it more difficult with that particular form that you have mentioned. My intent on this is, notwithstanding any other policies, when possible, try to maximize people's access to natural sunlight. It's something that there's a lot of public health research around the value of access to natural sunlight, especially indoors. And so when possible, it would be great if we could maximize that. And so really it's a value statement that hopefully we can adjust design standards in a friendly way to developers that would encourage, hey, if you got something south-facing, if you're capable of adding windows there, and it's not going to be a major issue here, we should encourage that.
Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I would, this is one where I would hope to table, not just because we're anxious for time, but there's certain applications that I've been contemplating in this area for energy efficiency purposes that are often precluded by some of our current restrictions. And so that's going to be some wordsmithing. I think we can get to what you're shooting at, some of the ideas that I had, not necessarily for a comp plan, but now that it's in here, might as well put it in. And it kind of gets to, I think, what Councilmember Fletcher's getting at as well. And I think with a little more wordsmithing and intentionality, we can get there. So if the author is willing to table for that purpose, that's what I would move.
I'm fine with that, so I'll be happy to make the motion to table, and I can work with Council Members Reich and Fletcher on this item.
We have a motion and a proper second to table this item. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And the next item is G335. Is there any discussion on that item, Councilmember Fletcher and Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. I am going to move to table this one. I think that we're going to need much clearer definitions of both well-maintained and original craftsmanship to know that this makes any sense. Mm-hmm. But I'm certainly happy to talk about it offline.
Councilmember Johnson.
Yeah, I would say that this item, this amendment, is based off of overwhelming constituent feedback that I've heard, especially about the value of well-maintained craftsman-built bungalow homes within my ward specifically. We know that when you have demolition of homes, there's obviously a huge carbon footprint, environmental footprint associated with that. And so I think it makes sense that we encourage development and density to take place, ideally prioritizing homes that are in poor states, poor condition, where we can continue to maintain naturally occurring affordable housing in our city that already exists and advance those climate action goals and be responsive to constituent feedback as well. So I personally feel comfortable with the language today. If others have suggested amendments, I would be interested to hear them.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also have concerns about this language just because I think this could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it's quite a lot of one interpretation of this would be significant regulation for who and who cannot do what they want with their property. And this is certainly something we have been dealing with for a very long time. Most of the demolitions are, of course, in Southwest Minneapolis, where single-family homes are being torn down and reconstructed into larger new single-family homes. But across the city, trying to define original craftsmanship, it starts to get into ideas of historic preservation, where this plan has really worked to try to have a more culturally inclusive definition of how we're approaching preservation of buildings. So I think perhaps unintentionally, likely unintentionally, this may be a little bit at odds with some of the other goals of the plan. So I appreciate the time to dig into the details of this and make sure that we're being clear about what folks can expect from this kind of policy in the comp plan.
Councilmember Ellison.
I'll just echo with what Fletcher and Bender have said. In my ward, the prospect of preservation has been a huge stressor for constituents in my ward, and this language is just a little bit too close. I don't know if that's the intention of the author, but I could just automatically, I'm seeing that becoming a tension. And again, the stress for folks feeling like they're not allowed to do what they feel like they should do with their homes is already something that I'm dealing with in we're dealing with in Ward 5, and so I'd love just an opportunity to peel into that a little bit more. So,
Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The call for clarification of the language and avoiding unintended consequences, I join that sort of concern, but I also think there's a possibility to further enhance what's being taught, not only discourage demolition, but encourage deconstruction, and how that could reinforce other policies. And so I think if we could table in that spirit of trying to get the clarity, avoiding unintended consequences, and maybe even enhancing the policy on other areas, it would be well worth our time. So that would be my motion. Or no, I'll
that motion is already on the floor. Councilmember Goodman.
I mean, we just went through like about 100 amendments that are meaningless unless someone takes them on and does something with them anyway. So I'm not sure how this is any different than that. Discourage is about the weakest word you could use. It doesn't say prevent, prohibit, or anything strong. It just basically says, like, we don't like that perfectly good houses that are in fairly good shape shouldn't be demolished. I mean, I'm not sure how much weaker that could be as a preservation initiative. And we just passed dozens of things that were just ideas that no one took on. So I just don't see what the problem is with this. I mean, just generally speaking, it's a statement that we would prefer to not demolish well-maintained housing. I guess I'll also say for the record that happens in the 7th Ward too, and we hate it. And so we would rather have somebody enhance their well-maintained or even partially maintained house and keep it on its footprint than demolish it. So I think this is pretty weak language that we could all agree. Anyone who wants to work on this after the comp plan has the responsibility to take it on. Since Councilmember Johnson has 85 amendments, I assure you we won't get to all of them. So I don't think there's too much concern that this is coming through in the next couple weeks.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. I will clarify, you do not have 85 amendments. It's 56 amendments, slightly less than 85. And I really appreciate your comments, Councilmember Goodman, on this. Also note for Councilmember Reich that I do have an amendment actually related to deconstruction of homes that's going to be in another goal. So I think that that effort is already being done, and that we will be already taking that up. So I don't see a need to try to wordsmith it more and try to combine that. So I hope my colleagues will agree with Councilmember Goodman and support this.
So we have a motion on the floor to table this item to our next markup session. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say nay. That item carries. And we I will move that we continue this markup session to Wednesday, November 28th at 9:30, and to direct the clerk's office to put all proposed amendment packets for public access, to post all proposed amendment packets for public access. I also want to announce that the clerk will be posting summaries of all actions already taken today. And is there any discussion? Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to clarify that I know that council members have shared all of their amendments with long-range planning staff, but I wanted to reemphasize that there are policy amendments that have to do with transportation or affordable housing, and just again would reiterate my, encouragement that folks not only talk with their colleagues, particularly if you're bringing 56 amendments, but also talk with the staff who are most specific to that subject matter, because they did have the chance to look and review the original language, but probably have not had the chance to look at proposed amendments. And then second, I just wanted to say that since we did not get to any discussion of the maps, that I will be sharing publicly today, I guess, the map amendments that I had intended to bring with some explanation. So if you have any questions or concerns about that, please talk with me. But I just feel like we need to have some chance for the public to weigh in on pretty significant changes to the map, which is the core of the plan that we were not able to discuss today.
Councilmember Gordon and Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you. I just wanted to request that maybe all the information that we got provided to us in paper could also be posted on the agenda, not only the actions that we took, but the other proposals. So they'll be online and they'll be available. And I also wanted to clarify that it's my understanding that the proposal before us does maintain the front yard setbacks as exists right now.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. And the clerk has indicated.
Got it. And I'm in the queue.
Yeah, I was making a comment and then was going to acknowledge you, but I wanted to address Councilmember Gordon's concern that these items be placed on the agenda, and the clerk has acquiesced to that request. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to speak on and comment on something I've heard about going around and talking to all colleagues beforehand about these amendments. This is an imperfect process. We were told specifically what the process was going to be before we came here today. We were told to submit our amendments to staff by Tuesday. We did that. A lot of people were out of the office, by the way, last week, and so it's, we were expecting to get these in advance, have adequate time to review them, and frankly, I have heard from very few colleagues about any of their amendments as well. So I take a little bit of that personally because I am bringing forward a number of amendments, but I just want to say, we're all doing our best here. It's an imperfect process. Let's get through it.
Thank you. We have a motion on the floor to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? This meeting will reconvene on Wednesday, November 28th at 9:30 a.m. in these chambers. Thank you.